This House is now in session. Minutes of the meeting held on Friday, November 22nd, 2019, Tuesday, November 26, 2019, and Tuesday, December 3rd, 2019, to be confirmed.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that those minutes be confirmed.
The question is that the aforementioned minutes be confirmed. All those honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Me think the ayes have it. The aforementioned minutes are hereby confirmed.
Announcements by Your Honor the President, the Speaker. Messages from Her Excellency the General, petitions, papers, government notices, private members notices, notices of questions, reports from select committees.
All member for St. Joseph.
Mr. Speaker, I am commanded to lay the report of the Joint Select Committee on the Integrity in Public Life Bill.
First readings of bills.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the first reading of the Prevention of Corruption Bill 2019.
Make second that.
The question is that the aforementioned bill be read at your first time. All those honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Me think the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the first reading of the Money Laundering and Financing of Terrorism Prevention and Control Amendment Bill 2019.
Make second that.
The question is that the aforementioned bill be read here first time. All those honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Me think the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the first reading of the Control of Disposable Plastics Amendment Bill 2019.
The question is that the aforementioned bill be read here first time. All those honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Me think the ayes have it.
Statements by ministers, congratulatory and arbitrary speeches, personal explanations, motions for leave of absence, oral replies to questions, notices of motion for the adjournment of the House on matters of urgent public importance, orders of the day.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the suspension of Standing Orders 6, 16, 18, 20, 42, 5, 43, and 44 for the remainder of the day's sitting.
The question is that the aforementioned standing orders be suspended for the remainder of the day's sitting. All those honorable members in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. The aforementioned standing orders are hereby suspended.
Government business.
Government business is now the order of the day.
Order number 9, sir. In the name of the Honorable Minister of the Environment and National Beautification, to move the second reading of the returnable. Order number 12, sir. Sorry. In the name of the Honorable Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs, to move the second reading of the Money Laundering and Financing of Terrorism Prevention and Control Amendment number Bill 2019.
Honorable member for St. Joseph.
Mr. Speaker, in this chamber, I have previously alluded to a Greek myth of a king named Sisyphus. And less members of this chamber think that the only Greek myth I know is that of Sisyphus. I'd like to begin today by alluding instead to the myth of Scylla and Charybdis. And I hope that the cameras have picked up the blank look on the faces of the members of this chamber. Member for the city, sir, says that he knows Scylla personally. Scylla was a multi-headed monster. And sailors who had to travel through a particular strait in the Mediterranean, if they went too close to, very narrow strait, if they went too close to the side of Scylla, the multi-headed animal, the Hydra, would devour the sailors on the ship. So they had to steer clear of Scylla. Problem is, of course, that staying clear of Scylla meant that they had to navigate a little too close to a whirlpool called Charybdis. And by navigating too close to that whirlpool, sir, you found yourself in peril of certain doom. And therefore, when in today's media we speak of Scylla and Charybdis, it really describes a situation where there's danger at every turn. If you go left, there's danger. If you go right, there's also danger. Mr. Speaker, if you wonder what that has to do with the amendment to the Money Laundering and Financing of Terrorism bill, I make reference to it, sir, because in the international environment, Barbados is required to meet standards for a variety of things. In this context, we're required to meet specific standards for, or as they relate to, the fighting of money laundering and the fighting of terrorism financing. And those two things, sir, go hand in hand or hand in glove. But as we make adjustments to our regime, on the one side, we end up at risk of other dangers. And a recent situation in relation to charities, in a way, typifies that particular dilemma. Because, Mr. Speaker, we, as a country, acknowledge the importance of civic-mindedness and philanthropy. But the very civic-mindedness and philanthropy that we acknowledge and encourage through, for example, the establishment of charities, exposes us, sir, to a perceived risk of money laundering and the financing of terrorism. And I say perceived, Mr. Speaker, because in the Financial Action Task Force, that is the standard setting body in relation to these areas, it is considered that charities are ripe for use and abuse in terms of laundering money and using charities to finance terrorism. So our challenge, Mr. Speaker, is that we have to demonstrate an effective regime for the supervision of a whole raft of entities operating in Barbados. We have to demonstrate effective supervision in relation to banks, in relation to insurance companies, in relation to regular companies, in relation to companies that function in what we used to call our financial services sector, our international business sector. But we also have to demonstrate effective supervision of not-for-profit companies, of charities, of real estate agents, of lawyers, of accountants. Just about anybody, sir, or any entity that moves money for whatever reason has to fall in line as it relates to the international standards required to defeat money laundering. Dealers in precious metals, a whole set of entities, sir, have to fit within this particular regime. Today, this specific bill is intended to capture designated non-financial entities And as I said, I gave the example earlier of lawyers and accountants and real estate agents and so on. Every commercial enterprise in Barbados, whether you are a sole trader, whether you are a professional, whatever area of endeavor you are in, you have to demonstrate that you follow the highest standards in relation to the combating of money laundering and terrorism. So that brings us to this bill, sir. Because our experience in Barbados is that we have a Financial Services Commission that is able to regulate the banks. The central bank regulates the banks. The FSC regulates insurance companies and other entities. The companies registry has an obligation to look to regulate companies, and the International Business Unit has an obligation to look to regulate what happens in their sector. But throughout our recent history, in fact, perhaps throughout all of our history, that category of business people, accountants, lawyers, dealers in precious metals, and those kinds of things, those kinds of enterprises, have had no supervisory regulation in place. So it is obvious, sir, that lawyers have to meet the highest standards in relation to money laundering. But we have no system for checking to see if, in fact, they are meeting that standard. It has therefore become necessary, sir, for us to allow the Anti-Money Laundering Authority to establish a compliance unit. And that compliance unit, Mr. Speaker, is going to be a small unit because we don't have the financial resources to have a big unit as might exist in other countries. But it's going to be a small unit, and that unit's job, Mr. Speaker, will be to interface with that category of individuals and try to ensure that they meet the highest standards in relation to fighting money laundering. And that, sir, is what brings us here today. Now, Mr. Speaker, what is the other side of this context? The FATF has been in place now for it's been in place for quite a few years. And Barbados has been a member of the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force. That's the regional affiliate. Our last mutual evaluation report was done in 2017, sir. And I regret to say that in 2017, Barbados rated poorly on most of the areas that we were assessed in. So we therefore entered into a follow-up regime where we had to take certain steps to try to bring all of our sectors into compliance with those standards. Unfortunately, sir, the last administration dropped the ball, and we've had to pick it up. And you might remember that earlier this year, we passed a set of amendments to legislation so as to meet certain technical requirements. Now, here's the thing, sir. A decade ago, the way the FATF worked, as long as you could check the boxes, you were fine. So as long as you had a law relating to this, a law relating to that, a law relating to the next, and the third, and the fourth, and the fifth, as long as you had a law relating to it, you were deemed to meet the standard. But it became very obvious that simply having a law relating to something could not be enough. And therefore, we now have a system which is two-tiered. You have to have a framework in place, statutes and so on, but you are now also obligated to demonstrate effectiveness. So a decade ago, 2 decades ago, we might have been fine just having a piece of legislation dealing with money laundering. But we are now called upon to demonstrate effectiveness. Now, what does that require? Well, they tell you the court system must be functioning properly, because the only way to deal with money laundering is to charge people and to confiscate assets and that kind of thing. And I can tell you, sir, that in all of the assessments that are being done, all of the evaluations of the Caribbean countries, of the international, of the countries that are international powerhouses, in every instance they look to see what your, not your checklist is, but what your score sheet is. And sir, you spend your days in the court, and I think you would know that Barbados is not a jurisdiction that has been confiscating anybody's assets. People get charged with drug offenses and trafficking in large amounts of drugs. And they get convicted, sir. And nobody has ever tried to confiscate their assets. We hardly have money laundering cases in our system. But it is obvious that if you have individuals who are thriving on the drug trade, that they have to find a way to launder the money. It's obvious. They have to find a way to launder the money. And you can launder money by going in town and buying jewelry. You can launder it by going and buying new motor cars. You can launder it, sir, by building houses, selling them on. But somehow, sir, somehow, and this is not a debate to criticize the law enforcement agencies or the DPP's office, or, well, not the judiciary. They can only do what comes to them. But somehow, sir, for us, a conviction has tended to be enough. And the International Standard Setting Agency is saying, no, it can't be enough. You have to go deeper, because the only way to put these people out of business, the only way to stem the money laundering that could be happening, is to actually confiscate the assets. And so earlier this year, we passed a piece of legislation which dealt, in my view, effectively, it's called the Proceeds and Instrumentalities of Crime Act, which gives sweeping powers to the authorities to confiscate assets, not just where you have a conviction, but also where you have reason to believe that a person is actually involved in criminal activity and is using his assets for that purpose. But as I said, sir, that has not been our history. And our landscape is now changing in front of us, because the International Standard Setting Body is saying, don't just tell me that you have passed the law. I want to see results. I want to see convictions. I want to see confiscations. Now, I spoke about Scylla and Charybdis earlier, because we are now being expected to operate within our legal system, I think, within our legal system, in a way that requires us now to do what other agencies expect us to do, and not what we are accustomed doing. Now, I don't have a problem with that, because if what we've been doing has not been sufficient, then we have to do more. So, Mr. Speaker, we are in an environment that is causing us to do things differently. It is causing us to, in some instances, maybe even contort ourselves to be able to meet these international standards. Because in instances, they have told us, you need to hire more staff. Now, we're in the middle of a BERT program. And we know what that BERT program means as far as government employing people. Are we in a position to go and employ the numbers of people that the international agency would look at and smile and say, yes, you're doing a good job? We can't. I keep saying to people that our financial crimes intelligence unit in the Royal Barbados Police Force has only a small number of officers, somewhere between 4 and 6. And the international agencies would like us to have maybe 20. But we have to operate not just within the strictures that are imposed by our financial circumstances, but we also have to operate based on risk assessment. And that is a phenomenon, sir, that is very much a feature of how we do business today, not just in other places, but also in Barbados. And we are beginning to say, let us approach this by looking at the risk. What is the risk? And you respond based on the risk. If the risk is low, then you can have a response commensurate. If the risk is high, then you also will have a response commensurate. But it means that one size does not fit all in relation to our responses. But sir, it isn't just about what the government can do. The private sector has to be involved in this process as well. And we will shortly be circulating to the private sector of Barbados, the entire private sector of Barbados, our national risk assessment report, so that they are in a position to see whether the areas in which they're operating in are high-risk areas or low-risk areas. So for example, sir, we know that in Barbados, there are certain kinds of enterprises that are low risk and some that are high risk. Real estate agents are low risk. And they're not low risk, sir, because we just say, well, man, we can put you in a low risk category. They're low risk because the way our real estate agents work in Barbados, they do not move money for our clients. But on the other hand, lawyers may be seen as high risk because lawyers move money for clients. But then, sir, not every lawyer either. Because some lawyers will operate in a particular level and do a large number of real estate transactions, a lot of trust transactions and so on. And they may move millions of dollars for clients in transactions. But a lawyer who only does litigation, in the old barrister's tradition, will not have any reason to hold large amounts of clients' monies. A lawyer whose practice is almost completely a criminal court practice will not be moving money for clients. A lawyer who only does magistrate's court work will not be moving large amounts of money for clients. So even in a profession where you may say there is a high risk of money laundering, one must also acknowledge that there are various layers or levels at which the risk may be low to non-existent. But in order to be able to satisfy our international standard setting bodies that we are dealing with it, we have to determine first what the risk is, and then we have to put measures in place. And again, sir, this compliance unit is part of that process. But as I said, the private sector has an important role to play. You know, years ago, when this concept of know your client came about, it was considered to be a nuisance. And in fact, it probably still is. And for those of you who might not immediately recollect, the know your client, also known as KYC obligation, is that you take steps before you accept a person as a client or a person as a trading partner to establish in a way that is beyond doubt, I suppose, exactly who you're dealing with. So anytime you accept a client now, sir, you will routinely ask for 2 pieces of ID. And you will also ask for a utility bill. And you will also ask for a bank reference and a reference letter from your accountant or your lawyer. This is beginning to sound familiar, I'm sure, because when you go to open a bank account, you are met with exactly the same requests. Because even the banks are saying, we have to know our clients. Years ago, so I remember when I opened my first bank account, it was at BNB, as it formerly was called. And Mr. Speaker, I believe that I did have an ID card at that time. I was always a little precocious, so I got my ID card as soon as my age allowed. And so I had a little piece of ID, but that was all. That was all, sir. Now, if a 16-year-old wants to open a bank account, believe you me, the bank will still be asking for a utility bill, 2 pieces of ID, and reference letters, and proof of address. But the world has changed. We're operating in a very different environment than we used to. And added to this now is something that we've all come to accept grudgingly, the concept of being a PEP, a person in public life. So all of us in here are persons in public life, and our spouses and children are now tainted by that brush. And so transactions that used to be simple, you wanted to borrow a piece of change to buy a car, all of a sudden as a person in public life, you are now subjected to an even higher level of scrutiny because of the risk of corruption and having then to deal with the proceeds of ill-gotten gains. I think we all wish for that simpler time, sir. But that simpler time is almost like the myth of Scylla and Charybdis. It is almost like the myth of Sisyphus, things of distant memory and fading into the mist of time. The environment today, sir, and you know, I've spoken about it from time to time in this chamber. Terrorism is a real issue, and if we allow ourselves to find false comfort into thinking that it does not affect us, you're wrong. You're very wrong. We know what movements have been taking place because of intelligence, and we know what is happening in relation to Trinidad and Jamaica and other parts of the region, which have the risk of bringing terrorism incidents close to our shores. I remind you that only a year and a half ago, or was it last year, sir, Trinidad Carnival was at risk because of a potential terrorist attack. And as we prepare for Kadooment every year, we also prepare for our Kadooment in Barbados with a view to ensuring that we do not fall prey to any terrorist attacks. But, sir, terrorists don't spend monopoly money. Terrorists, whether they're big or small, rely on individuals to fund their enterprises. And that is what this is all about. Trying to strangle off the movement of funds to terrorists in order to fund their enterprises. And that's the connection, sir. It is not an environment that we want. I've been speaking to attorneys and they say, oh Lord, man, you know, you're setting up a compliance unit now to come and check my transactions. Sir, I've tried to explain that we cannot want to be operating in a modern world but want to ask to be exempted from certain rules and procedures. Mr. Speaker, what is at risk for Barbados is something that should cause any Barbadian to lose sleep at night. And that is, Mr. Speaker, the specter of Barbadian banks losing correspondent banking. I've mentioned it in this chamber before, but let me refresh the members of this House minds. We are able to function and do commerce the way that we've been accustomed doing it, because when you trigger a payment in US dollars in Barbados, whether it is at FCAB or Republic or First Citizen, doesn't matter the bank, when you say, I want to send money overseas, whether it is to send school your child, to buy a book, or to buy medication at the QEH, that transaction has to be facilitated by an overseas bank. And that overseas bank is what is called the correspondent bank. And therefore you get the term correspondent banking. Because we cannot move our money from here, or no matter how many US dollars we have in our system, if we cannot find a way effectively to move it from here to where it needs to go so as to be able to buy for Barbadian supplies, goods and services, then, sir, we can't do nothing. Plain and simple. In the last decade, the region has lost, I believe the most recent figure I got was in the region of 100 correspondent banking relationships. The region now only has about 12 or 14, somewhere in that region, correspondent banks. That means that globally there are just over a dozen financial powerhouses that are willing to deal with Barbados financial institutions in terms of the movement of money. And we've been blessed by the fact that we've had significant Canadian banking presence in Barbados. Scotia, FCAB, and Royal. And they have therefore, because they are part of a global network, major international financial institutions, then people are comfortable dealing with them because they are satisfied that Royal Bank, for example, meets the highest level of standard in relation to combating money laundering in their transactions. They're satisfied that FCAB is doing it. They're satisfied that Scotia is doing it. But those are international powerhouses. But smaller regional banks don't have the benefit of that comfort value. And therefore, we have to have the strongest possible regulatory framework in Barbados so that when international institutions, whether it's banks or otherwise, are dealing with Barbados-based transactions, they know that these transactions have been filtered down to a T to ensure that there's no taint of money laundering or financing of terrorism. And that is our obligation, sir. As a government, we have to have a regulatory framework that is strong enough and robust enough to satisfy our international partners that we have fought and filtered out any risk of money laundering so that they can do their transaction without worrying. Because you see what happens, sir? If an international bank, one of our correspondent banks, takes a transaction from a Barbadian, money moving from Barbados, that is tainted by terrorism, then they run the risk of having to pay millions upon millions of dollars of fines. And many of them, I say the region was serviced by, we've lost over 100 correspondent banking relationships in the last few years because they have said, I am not prepared to take that risk with financial institutions in the region. Only a few weeks ago, I had the benefit of, well, I had the responsibilities there, not a benefit, I had the responsibility of attending a meeting in Washington, D.C., as they say, on the Hill, to meet with Congresswoman Maxine Waters, who is the head of the Congress Financial Services Committee. And it was a delegation made up of, it was led by Prime Minister Gaston Brown from Antigua. Prime Minister Alan Chastanet was in attendance. I represented our own Prime Minister, the Honorable Mia Mottley, and then the diplomatic corps from across the region. The Minister of Finance for Bermuda was also in attendance. And that meeting, hosted in the US Congress, brought together a number of major banks, US legislators, and Caribbean leaders so that we could discuss this issue of correspondent banking and try to ensure that correspondent banking for the region is not threatened. We had to discuss it. And it just goes to show, sir, that this is not something that we just getting up in here on Tuesday and talking about. This has real international ramifications for us and can drive our economies into the ground. So we are at risk of losing correspondent banking relationships if we do not have a regime in place that can satisfy our international partners that we have filtered out any risk of money laundering. But that also affects the businesses that function in Barbados. It affects them too. Because those entities that are operating in what used to be called the international financial services arena, they have to be able to move money for transactions. And again, if Barbados is not operating at the highest regulatory level, then they become at risk. And what will happen is they can say, look, I cannot vouch for the Barbados banking system. I cannot vouch for the integrity of the Barbados commercial system, and therefore I have to pick up my business and move it to someplace else that meets the highest standard. Now, since taking responsibility for this particular area, Barbados has been complimented on the great strides that it has made in terms of putting new legislative instruments in place, in terms of tightening up on our regulatory framework. And I know that intuitively Barbadians will object to and will resent regulation being imposed on them. And the situation with the charities is a part of that. And you know, sir, the history of that is that the company's registry in August, we have about 1,400 charities in Barbados, and the company's registry in August sent out letters to every single charity so as to be able to find out what charities are still functioning, what the particular charities are doing, and perhaps more importantly, whether they receive or send money to or from or to any international partners. Because what you want to check for and track is the movement of money so that you can be satisfied that it is legitimate and not being funneled towards terrorist groups. Of the 1,400 people to whom letters were sent, and I accept that because people will have moved and addresses changed and email addresses changed and so on, some people, I'm quite sure, did not get the correspondence. But less than 100 of the charities responded. And another letter was sent. And less than 100 charities responded again. Now, the point about regulating an area, sir, I don't want to call it an industry, but the point about regulating is that you have to say to people, look, things have changed. You've got to operate in a different environment. We can no longer have 1,400 charities in Barbados and nobody knows what they're doing. So you have to tell us what we're not trying to tell you what to do, but we have to know what you're doing. And we have to know we have to be able to satisfy ourselves that any sources that you get money from overseas are legitimate. And that sources and places that you may send money to overseas are also legitimate. I'm happy to say that it is unfortunate that we had the confusion, and we apologize for that. But the good news is, sir, that the charities have begun to respond in their hundreds. They've begun to respond in their hundreds. And so now, for the first time, we are in a position to see exactly what our charities are doing and how they're operating. Thank you. For the first time. And this is going to continue because you can't regulate and monitor activity by an occasional outreach. It has to be sustained. And I take the liberty of saying that we recognize that many of the charities are not in a financial position to meet some of the statutory requirements. Some charities, sir, might collect $2,000 or $3,000 a year. And the bookkeeping, I suppose it would still be fair to call it that because it might not reach the level of being accounting. The bookkeeping is being done by somebody who is involved in it. Many of us as members of parliament are associated with or have charities. And I believe that the receipts They would have, my colleagues would have to tell me otherwise, but the receipts are not large amounts of money, and therefore to take those resources and invest in accountants and so on to do financial statements and things of that sort. I mean, you're operating in a voluntaristic system, so you just don't have the resources for those things. But we're going to require of you that you maintain certain minimum standards. And I will say, because I don't anticipate too many contributions in this debate, we will shortly be having a supplementary so as to be able to put a modest amount of funding in place to be able to help charities better cope with this new regulatory regime. We don't want our 1,400 charities to disappear because they all work to support what we as members of parliament do. They may do it differently, they may do it with different focus, but they're all part of a society caring for each other. So we want to have charities, we want them to do well, because every person that is aided by a charity in Barbados is perhaps one less person that a member of parliament has to respond to. They are a valuable adjunct to what we do as MPs. But we're putting money in place so as to be able to assist those individuals who have charities but who have difficulty meeting the standards of this regulatory framework to do so. And I believe those funds should be available early in the new year. Mr. Speaker, we have submitted a series of reports to the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force so that they can take note of the strides that we've made and grade us and rate us, sir. And I'm satisfied that we have made a significant amount of strides, but we are not there yet. We've submitted in November, we submitted a follow-up report, and we've just got back comments on that follow-up report, and we are responding to those comments, and in January, we will have what is called a face-to-face meeting. So a delegation from Barbados will sit and meet with the representatives of the Americas Working Group, and we will say where we are, and they will say what we think is deficient, and we will rebut and respond and try to come up with a position which is accepted in terms of where we are. And that is perhaps the beauty of the FATF process. In other international fora, sir, you will know that we don't get the benefit of being able to sit at the table. Dictates are made from foreign capitals and they say do this or do that. In the FATF process, we sit at the table and we get an opportunity to argue robustly and try to change minds on what our system is supposed to be. To come back to the bill as I close, sir, we feel that we have to do this. This is the second time for the year that we're amending the money laundering legislation. When we came to this chamber early in the year, we felt that we had a satisfactory system in place. But as part of that interactive process, we are now accepting that we need to go a little bit further in terms of the non-financial entities, and therefore we are bringing this bill to Parliament. I believe that it is, as I said, I don't think Barbadians especially like to be regulated, like to have their affairs peered into, but let me make it clear. It is a risk-based model that we're following. So only if your particular practice fits into that high-risk profile will you then have any reason to relate to the compliance unit. And the compliance unit will be asking you for information, and based on that information, they will then ask for further information. But essentially, their job is not to try and pry into who paying you fees and things of that sort. That is not what they're about. What they're going to be interested in is whether there are any transactions that can be considered to be suspicious transactions, and whether those transactions require a second look. And so, In this new regime, I'll be asking all the accountants and the lawyers and the other enterprises just to cooperate with the unit, because they're not here to police you, but they are here to be able to render an important service. You know, so a lot of people just do business, and as long as they collect the fee, they don't worry too much about what it entails. You know, they don't look twice. So they take money, do a transaction, that's it. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure, and I really should be wrapping up, but let me make this point. I well recollect some years ago an individual looking to do a real estate transaction. It wasn't huge, but the amount of money was certainly more than $150,000. And this person brought the money into our office in cash. Cash, sir. $150,000+ in cash. And we told him, no, sir, we're not taking that. Can't bring that in here, because I don't know where it came from. Cannot bring it in here. So however you deal with it, you deal with it, and you bring back to us your banker's draft for the amount of money, and we are happy. But you cannot bring that kind of money in here in cash, because we cannot account to anybody for its provenance. Now, I've heard about many instances where people love to get cash. But in the new media, you can't function that way anymore. So, as things have changed, we must also change in response. It's not always going to be painless, because it requires us to open up to regulatory bodies so that they can see what we're doing. But it is not new. It is happening every other part of the world. Now, the bar will say, but we already have a bar association. But the bar association does not look at your transactions to see if you follow Know Your Client procedures. The bar association does not look at your transactions to see if any of them are suspicious. It isn't made up to do that. And the same thing with the accountants, not made up to do that. So we have to fill the gap, otherwise Barbados will find itself being rated low compliant or non-compliant in areas such as this. I ask the Chamber to support this bill wholeheartedly. I apologize to the honourable member, the Leader of the Opposition, for having to debate it with this haste. But, sir, this is a situation where it really was unavoidable. I think that we've been on the receiving end of the Leader of the Opposition's criticism from time to time in the past, sir. It is not something that we want to do. But the fact is that, as happened last year when we had in December to pass, I think it was about 16 bills, so that we could meet a timeline for an international agency. We don't want to do it. I believe that members would have preferred not to be in this chamber at all today. I can see it on your face, sir. Perhaps people can see it on mine. But we have an obligation to respond to these challenges as they arise, not for our egos, not because we want to say we pass another law, but because of what it means to Barbadians. And any step that has to be taken to safeguard our international reputation as a financial hub, any step that has to be taken to safeguard correspondent banking relationships, sir, then as a parliament, we must say we are prepared to make the sacrifice of our time and to suffer the inconvenience. I commend this bill. It is yet another step that we have to make so as to avoid the proverbial Scylla on one side and the proverbial Charybdis on the other side. But over the last 18 months, sir, we have been beset by perils of all kinds. But this administration has not just stayed the course, we have also steered the course. the course. You like that? Huh? You like that?
Got that from you just now.
And therefore, sir, we will take this country between the perils of Scylla and Charybdis. They beset us every day, whether it is in garbage trucks, or buses, or roads, financial institutions, international bodies, whatever. But we are staying the course and steering the course, and I'm obliged to you. I beg to move, sir, that this bill be read a second time.
Honourable Member for St. Peter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I will not be too long because I think, and maybe not for the reason that the Honourable Attorney General identified in terms of when he looked closely at your face. But my voice is going. But I thought I needed to add a little bit to the fulsome exposition that the Honourable Attorney General would have shared with this Honourable Chamber. And I'm doing so as the one who has been assigned the role of third sector relations in terms of ministerial responsibility. I want to reiterate the Honourable Member for St. Joseph's position, which is government's position, that there are significant changes in the international financial environment. We recognize that it is now much easier to move money. We have moved away from walking with cash, and I speak from my experience in the tourism sector. We've moved away from traveler's checks. There are no distant memories. Credit cards, debit cards, and when debit cards were first introduced, they were only domestic. Now you have international debit cards, all kinds of new financial instruments, but also modes of moving money. And we recognize as a government that with that increasing complexity, there's the need for an increased or heightened approach to how we manage and oversee that process and those processes that come as a result of the changes in the financial climate. Now, I also want to indicate that Barbados understands terrorism. Barbados in 1976 had a taste, and incidentally, it was this Barbados Labour Party recently in office that had to deal with terrorism, international terrorism in our territorial waters. So we are not unmindful of the role of financing in terrorist activities, and we are not unmindful of the fact that terrorist activities can take place, do take place, and in fact have taken place very close to us. A Cubana Airlines flight that took off from an airport, or airport right here in Barbados. And so, even though some are loath to refer to that as terrorism, we in Barbados have recognized it from 1976 as an act of terrorism. We are opposed to terrorism. And as a government, we are opposed to doing anything that will facilitate terrorist activity. And so the matter of compliance with the rules set by Financial Action Task Force and all the entities that speak to and help to guide the global community as it relates to reducing the opportunity for the financing of terrorism, we support. we recognize that not all of their edicts are immediately suitable to small island developing states like ours, but we recognize that there must be rules, and that rules must be followed. We also understand, Mr. Speaker, that small island developing states are sometimes targeted for the funneling of money because there is often the feeling that in these small states like ours, there is not the robust and rigorous monitoring of financial activity. And so the unscrupulous among us, and I say that I mean the among us in the international community, the unscrupulous among us will often try to target the links that are weak in the system. And they sometimes believe that small states represent those weak links. And so this bill before this honorable chamber really speaks to ensuring that Barbados is not a weak link in the chain, in the system that seeks to avoid us being facilitators, even if unwittingly, of terrorist activity and the money laundering that drives it in our world today. At the same time, we acknowledge that third sector organizations, civil society organizations, charities are an integral part of the fabric of the Barbadian society. They have been for decades, in some cases, centuries. If we go back to Landship and Susus and those maybe more informal structures, but structures that were outside of the realm of public sector and outside of the realm of private sector. Facilities, organizations, constructs that really spoke to people, ordinary people in society, taking charge of their own destiny and putting these constructs in place that would allow them coming together, being their brothers and sisters' keeper, to develop the societies that they were a part of. We recognize their invaluable contribution. We recognize that as a government, we would not be able to do all that ought to be done for the people of our country without partnership with third sector organizations. We could not do it. We can't do it in the situation that we're in after being dealt such a terrible hand by the administration that preceded us. But, Mr. Speaker, even in the best of times, there will never be enough resources that will allow a government to be able to deal with, handle, and address all of the needs of the people of our society. Our government's value of the third sector has caused the Honourable Member for St. Michael Northeast to create within her cabinet the responsibility for third sector relations, because we recognize the importance and we value the contribution that these organizations make to our society, and we value the partnership. Our approach as a government to partnership is now almost legendary, because when you speak to members of the social partnership, they will tell you that they have spent more constructive hours in partnership relations with this government than they did in the 10 years that preceded our coming to office. They tell you that, and they are happy to spend entire days dialoguing among ourselves and sharing their perspectives so that we can move this country forward. That is this government's approach to partnership with those outside of government. The Social Justice Committee is also another example of our government's commitment to partnership, so that we meet monthly. The Ministry of People's Empowerment and Elder Affairs, as the deputy chair of the committee that I chair, and we engage with not just private sector and public sector and workers' organizations, but we engage with third sector organizations, civil society organizations, charities operating in this country, because we believe that they have a role to play in the development of policy, because almost all policy affects ordinary people. And so we have brought them to the table, and I must say it is not just an altruistic action on our part. They have been asking for many years for a seat at the table. And so in some respects, we have responded to their requests, and they are now sitting at the table where they can input on government policy and share their perspectives on those policies. And so we see third sector organizations as friends, as partners, not as foes, not as enemies. The Honorable Attorney General has proffered the apology on behalf of government to third sector organizations, and this relates to the advertisement that was placed in the newspaper. And as a sensitive and caring government, we recognize that even though a functionary may have thought that that was the step they had to take, we also believe that in dealing with organizations, in dealing with partners, we don't shout at them, we work with them. And that was the reason why we would have had just, I think last Friday, the press conference where we indicated that the action was not intended to be punitive, even though we believe it could have been done in a better way. And I want to say here clearly to you, Mr. Speaker, and to the chamber and to the public, that that advertisement does not and was not intended to suggest to the public that any of the charities listed in the advertisement are involved in any illegal, illicit activity, any corrupt practices, any misuse of funding or financing. Many of those charities that were listed have been placed in a situation where there is now or has been some suspicion over why they were listed. And I want to say very clearly, and on behalf of government, because this is something we discuss in cabinet, that we are not, government is not, the registrar who placed the ad is not suggesting to the public and to donors, both current or potential, that there is any bad activity, illegal activity, illicit activity taking place in those listed charities. The only reason why that list was presented to the public in that advertisement is because they had not responded to a survey. No, Mr. Speaker, I am part of government and I am part of the public sector. But I am not afraid to say that government has to change the way it interacts with people and with organizations in this society. We have to stop this thing about shouting at people. And I say that even as I realize that my voice is increasing in decibels. So I don't want to shout in the chamber and say that we ought not to be shouting at organizations. The organizations that have interacted with me as minister responsible for third sector relations have indicated that some of them received a survey, but no indication as to what the survey was intended to do. Now, the Attorney General explained that fully in the press conference. We all know now what the intention was. The reason why I say we have to change the way we interact with our people and our organizations is because after having spent so many millions educating people, then those of us in the public service, when we interface with people outside of us, we have to explain more. Don't just send letters to people and tell them fill this out and send it back. Tell them why. We are all intelligent people. Those who manage TSOs, third sector organizations and charities, all intelligent people, they deserve the respect of knowing why you are asking for the information you're asking for. And that is all I will say as it relates to how we interact. I think we have to, in all cases, and this is something that our administration is really fighting hard with. Government has become known only to be interested in controlling and making sure that rules are followed. This government, and the Prime Minister would have shared this in early budget debates, we would have indicated that this government sees itself as a facilitator of development in this country. We recognize that we have a role in preserving law and order, because if a government does not do that, nobody else will. And then the rule of the jungle will prevail. So government does have a role in making sure that the rules are followed. Government also has a role, and in my view, an equal role, to be a facilitator. And that will mean, Mr. Speaker, that we need to communicate a lot better. We need to treat to other organizations as partners and not as minions to be spoken to. They are partners in development. In many cases, Mr. Speaker, they do more than some government departments do as it relates to the development of society. Because many of these charities, many of these third sector organizations are driven by people who are full of passion for the causes that they represent, that they choose to represent, that they are often not paid to represent. Such is their passion, such is their zeal, and that is to be recognized, that is to be facilitated, while we as a government ensures that the rules are followed. Now, that monitoring and the importance of the monitoring, the Honourable Member for St. Joseph spoke to quite clearly, and we are asking all charities to respond to the survey. We have to comply because we have to make sure that well-meaning organizations in this country are not being unwittingly used as funnels for the washing or the cleaning or the laundering of ill-gotten gains in this country. And that is the reason why the survey was sent out, and that is the reason why response is necessary if charities and other third sector organizations are to remain listed as charities. We are just trying to ensure that we do not have a repeat of 1976. When I don't remember all the names, but I remember one name was Bosch, if I'm not mistaken, Orlando Bosch. Terrorists of an earlier era, but we as a country want to ensure that there is no repeat of that. Barbados does not play in the terrorism space. We don't now, we haven't in the past, and we don't want to do it in the future. And so we're asking all charities to participate, to help us really, to help us and to help themselves, to help the country, because we know that they are just as passionate as we are about ensuring that this country grows, develops, and maintains high standards so that we are well respected among the family of nations in this world. Government recognizes that not all of the charities have the capacity to do all that is necessary to maintain the highest of standards. Charities, third sector organizations, very driven by passion. But I've interacted with a number of people who, and I say this from my finance perspective, people who you encourage to keep records. And they will tell you, and they will say to me, I went and I bought this and that and that and that. But when I got home and I emptied my pockets, I pelted everything in the garbage. Bills and all, because there are many of us who believe that once we have paid, and I think the attorneys would call this given consideration, and we've received an article or service in return, that the transaction is ended and there's no need for further record keeping. Now, in this new world that the Honorable Attorney, the learned Attorney General referred to, record keeping is going to be essential, and not just financial record keeping. We recognize as a government that there are some, at least some, maybe many, of our charities and other third sector organizations that do not have this capacity, that may not be oriented in that way, the record keeping that is necessary to ensure that funds are traceable, that the spending of money is appropriate and aligned with what are the aims and objectives of the organization. And so as a government, we have indicated, and we are in the process of making sure that we create vehicles that will allow for the building of the capacity of third sector organizations. We have identified a few areas, and in our communication with third sector organizations, they have identified some as well. But in the area of governance, for example, in the area of governance, there is the need for increased capacity. And we intend to assist third sector organizations in this way. In the area of financial management, as I just spoke to, we also intend to assist third sector organizations, charities, those that cannot help themselves. We intend to work with established charities, but also multilateral organizations. We've already started those discussions with the IDB, with the UNDP. We've started discussion, or we've had some initial talks with Aspire Foundation, and these are all organizations that will be working with us to build the capacity of third sector organizations, of charities, so that they are able to operate in this new world, in this new environment that is asking them for much more than they were asked for in the past. Proposal writing is another one. Many of them want to do projects, and in a lot of cases there's funding available, but how to construct the proposal that makes the proposal attractive enough to garner the funds is an area of weakness. In the area of advocacy, how does an organization advocate on behalf of the cause that its founders are so passionate about? And even as we speak, the European Union is working in partnership with the Caribbean Broadcasting Union and executing as right now, a series of workshops on advocacy. Because if an organization set up to advocate on a particular cause is not able to do it well, effectively, then it becomes irrelevant, and all the passion and all the zeal of its founders could really be lost. And so, Mr. Speaker, I just want to, even as I support the bill before this honorable chamber, the bill that speaks to setting up the compliance unit, I want to reiterate to Barbados and to civil society, to third sector organizations, we see you as partners in development. We recognize that your role is critically important. We will be doing all that we can to facilitate your work. And so the draft cabinet paper that is right now within our ministry, and I think a file has gone to the Ministry of Finance for their comment, but we are working on that draft cabinet paper that will ask cabinet to speak to what we've said in our manifesto, which is providing that framework that will allow for the facilitation and the growth and the development of the third sector. In our manifesto at page 47, Mr. Speaker, we say quite clearly, a Barbados Labour Party government will establish and work with a steering committee of third sector groups to promote and facilitate the development of a thriving, connected, engaged, energized, and effective third sector in Barbados, one that is capable of strong social and economic impact and of positioning Barbados as an international center for third sector engagement and collaboration. If we are to get to the point where we are seen and actually are an international center, it will mean that we will need to lift our game. We will need to build our capacity. We will need to be complying with those laws, rules, and regulations that speak to better management and better governance. This bill before this Honorable Chamber is part of the process of getting third sector organizations and getting charities to the point that this party is advocating, that point where we are seen as an international center for third sector engagement and collaboration. I'm obliged to you.
Mr. Speaker. Sorry.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that the House be suspended for 10 minutes until midday.
The question is that this honorable chamber be suspended for 10 minutes. All those honorable members in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. This honorable chamber stands suspended for 10 minutes.